Ever feel like you just want to cut through the noise and get to the heart of a story? Like really understand the details behind a big event.
I think a lot of people feel that way these days, especially with so much information flying around.
Right. And there are some events that, no matter how much time has passed, still seem to spark a lot of debate, a lot of questions. Like, for instance, the moon landing.
Yeah, that's certainly one for the history books. Even today, there are folks who have their doubts.
It's wild, isn't it? So today we're going deep, diving headfirst into the life and career of Neil Armstrong, the very first person to walk on the moon. And we're doing it with that documentary, the one, Astronauts Gone Wild, an investigation into the authenticity of the moon landings, kind of looming in the background.
It's interesting how something so monumental, something that captivated the entire world, can still generate that level of skepticism. But by really taking a close look at Neil Armstrong, his journey, the whole context of the Apollo 11 mission, we might understand it all a bit better. We've got some great sources to work with. His Wikipedia page, info surrounding the documentary itself, things like that.
It's almost like getting a behind-the-scenes look. And that's our goal here,
Yeah.
to pull out those really important and interesting bits about Armstrong's life and this incredible achievement. Think of it as your express lane to becoming a Neil Armstrong expert. Okay, let's jump in. So Neil Armstrong, born and raised in Wapakoneta, Ohio. From the beginning, it seems like he was just destined for the skies.
Absolutely. His Wikipedia page actually mentions he had his very first airplane ride at a ridiculously young age, like 5 or 6. Imagine that, back when aviation was still relatively new. Talk about a life-changing experience.
I bet. It's like something straight out of a movie? And get this, he earned his student pilot certificate on his 16th birthday. He even soloed an airplane shortly after,
Wow.
before he could legally drive a car. That's some serious dedication to flying.
That shows you where his priorities were. And it's also worth pointing out his involvement with the Boy Scouts. Becoming an Eagle Scout is no small feat. Years of commitment, developing all sorts of skills, leadership, all that stuff.
The kind of qualities that would serve someone, well, oh, I don't know, on a mission to the moon, maybe.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a passing phase for him either. His connection to the Scouts stayed strong throughout his life.
You're kidding. Even during the Apollo 11 mission.
Yeah, even then. While he was on his way to the moon in 1969, he sent greetings to a National Scout Jamboree that was happening in Idaho. And check this out, he actually took a World Scout badge with him to the lunar surface and back.
Wow. Talk about taking your values with you wherever you go. That's a story I'll never forget. But his path to becoming an astronaut wasn't a straight shot, was it? He was a naval aviator first, right?
Right. But before that, he actually studied aeronautical engineering at Purdue University.
Makes sense, given his love of flying. But I read somewhere that his decision to go to Purdue was kind of influenced by a football game.
Yeah, that's a fun little detail. Apparently, he saw Purdue beat Ohio State, and it made a real impression on him. It was a bit of an upset, and something about that victory, that underdog spirit, really resonated with him. Plus, he had an uncle who recommended Purdue's engineering program, said it was one of the best and conveniently close to home.
So, football and family advice led him to Purdue. And his tuition was actually covered by the Holloway Plan, which required him to serve in the Navy afterward. It's like all these pieces of his life were falling into place, leading him towards this incredible destiny.
It really is remarkable how it all unfolded. And his time in the Navy, let me tell you, it was more than just a routine service commitment. He became a midshipman, then a naval pilot, flying Grumman F-9F Panther jets right off the aircraft carrier USS Essex.
This is during the Korean War, right?
Got it. He flew 78 combat missions during that conflict, logging a crazy amount of flight time under some pretty intense conditions.
78 missions. Wow. That's a lot of experience under pressure. Did anything particularly memorable happen during his time in Korea?
Well, there's this incident where his aircraft got seriously damaged when he flew through a cable that was strung across a ridge during a low-level bombing run. Can you imagine?
Yikes. Talk about a close call. What happened?
According to his account, 6 feet of his wing was just ripped off. But despite that, he managed to fly the plane back to friendly territory. The damage was so bad, though, he had to eject. Some reports initially said it was anti-aircraft fire, but the cable story is the one you hear most consistently.
That takes some serious skill and nerve to pull off.
For sure. And he received the Air Medal and a bunch of other decorations for his service in Korea. Then, after the war, he went back to Purdue to finish his engineering degree.
So from combat pilot to college student, that must have been quite a transition.
It probably was. But his academic performance actually improved a lot when he returned. He also became more involved in campus life, joined a fraternity, even co-directed some student musicals.
Hold on. Neil Armstrong, the astronaut, directing musicals.
Yep, that's the story. And there's even this anecdote about him having a pretty rough landing in one of the Purdue Aeroflying Club's Aeronca aircraft. Damaged it so badly they had to tow it back on a trailer.
Even the first man on the moon had his share of not-so-perfect landings.
It just goes to show everyone makes mistakes. It's part of learning and growing, even for someone like Neil Armstrong.
I guess even the best of the best have those oops moments.
Mm,
And then, of course, he met his wife, Janet Sheeran, right?
that's right, at Purdue. She was studying home economics. They married in 1956 and had 3 kids. Sadly, their daughter Karen passed away from a brain tumor when she was just 2 years old.
It's heartbreaking to think about. That kind of loss must have had a huge impact on him and his family.
Absolutely. And from there, his path led him into the world of test piloting.
That's like stepping into a whole other level of intensity, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the air.
You could say that again. After Purdue, he became an experimental research test pilot for NICIA, which later became NASA. He was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in California, a legendary place for aviation research.
Edwards Air Force Base. You hear that name and you think of all those iconic test pilots breaking speed records and pushing the limits.
Exactly. And Armstrong was right there in the thick of it. He was involved in some pretty hair-raising incidents, too. One time, he was aboard a B-29 that was launching a skyrocket experimental aircraft when an engine failed and a propeller just disintegrated. They had to make this incredibly risky landing on only one engine.
That's intense. What else?
Well, he flew the North American X-15 7 times, reaching unbelievable heights. On one flight, he went over 207,000 feet, which is basically the edge of space. It
Wow.
was the longest X-15 flight ever in terms of time and distance.
207,000 feet. That's what, over 39 miles up?
That's right. He was getting used to some pretty extreme environments, that's for sure.
You have to wonder if those experiences helped prepare him for the challenges of spaceflight.
It's hard to say for sure, but it certainly couldn't have hurt. Now, what's interesting is that some of his colleagues thought his engineering skills were actually stronger than his pure flying ability.
Really? You wouldn't think that about a test pilot.
I know, right? But Michael Collins, who flew with Armstrong on Apollo 11, even said that Armstrong was one of the weaker, stick-and-rudder men, but the very best when it came to understanding the machine's design and how it operated.
So, more of an engineer's mind than a daredevil's, even though he was clearly both.
Exactly. Many of the engineers at Edwards really respected his technical knowledge, but some of the old-school pilots, guys like Chuck Yeager, weren't quite as impressed. They sometimes saw pilot engineers as overthinking things. There's even this famous story about Armstrong and Yeager getting a T-33 trainer aircraft stuck on a dry lake bed.
Sounds like a story you'd hear around the campfire at Edwards.
Totally. And then there was the Nellis affair, a series of incidents where Armstrong made a gear-up landing in an F-104 starfighter. Then a bunch of other pilots had their own mishaps trying to get him out of there. It was like a comedy of errors.
You can just picture it. All those seasoned test pilots scratching their
Yeah.
heads and trying to figure out how to get their buddy and his plane unstuck.
It's one of those stories that makes you realize even the best in the business have their off days.
So even before officially joining NASA, Armstrong was already involved with some early space program concepts.
Right, like the Air Force's Manned Space Soonest program and the X-20 Dinosaur, which was going to be a military space plane.
Talk about being ahead of the curve.
He was chosen for the Manned Space Soonest program, but ultimately NASA's Project Mercury took priority. Initially, he wasn't even eligible for Mercury because he was a civilian test pilot, but then came Project Gemini, and that's when things really started to align for him.
This was NASA's second human spaceflight program, focused on developing techniques for orbital rendezvous and docking, stuff they'd need for a moon mission. And for the first time, civilian test pilots could apply to be astronauts.
That was a huge turning point. So he applied, and get this, his application was actually submitted a bit late.
No way. That's cutting it close for someone who became so synonymous with space travel.
It is, isn't it? But as luck would have it, a friend of his, a flight simulator expert he'd worked with at Edwards, slipped his application into the pile. Talk about a good friend. He went through all those tough medical evaluations and, well, the rest is history.
And they call them the New Nine, this second group of astronauts.
Yeah.
And compared to the original Mercury 7, this group was younger and had more impressive academic credentials.
Yep. Michael Collins actually said that Armstrong was by far the most experienced test pilot out of all the astronauts at that point.
Makes you realize he wasn't just some random guy who got lucky. He had a serious resume.
No doubt about it. Now, even though he didn't actually fly on Gemini 5, he served as a backup crew member.
Which is still a pretty important role, right?
Absolutely. He learned a ton about space rendezvous, the challenges of long-duration spaceflight, all that crucial stuff. And then came Gemini 8, where he was the command pilot.
And this mission achieved something really big. The first ever docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. Think about that. It was a major step forward for space exploration.
Yeah, a huge moment. But the mission had to be cut short because of a really dangerous situation with a stuck thruster, which caused the spacecraft to spin uncontrollably.
I remember reading about that. It sounded pretty scary. And there was some talk afterwards that Armstrong and the other pilot, Dave Scott, could have handled things differently.
Yeah, some people in the astronaut office felt that way. They even said maybe Armstrong should have been able to salvage more of the mission. But a closer look later on showed those criticisms were mostly unfounded. They just didn't have clear procedures for that kind of malfunction back then.
So it was more of a systemic issue than pilot error.
Exactly. They figured out that both reaction control system rings had to be activated at the same time, not one by one like they thought initially. It was a tough lesson, but it helped them improve safety protocols going forward.
Makes you realize how much they were learning as they went along, pushing the boundaries of what was known. It was all new territory. And then he was the backup command pilot for Gemini 11, more of a mentoring role this time.
Yep. And after the Gemini program wrapped up, he and his wife went on a goodwill tour of South America, visited a bunch of different countries, meeting people, sharing experiences.
Sounds like a nice change of pace after all that intense training and flying.
I bet. But then, of course, came Apollo. And that tragic fire during the Apollo 1 test, that must have been a huge blow to everyone involved.
I can't imagine what it must have been like for Armstrong and the other astronauts.
Yeah, Armstrong was actually in Washington, D.C. the day of the fire for the signing of the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. He and the other astronauts there found out about it that evening.
Wow, what a contrast. Going from this hopeful moment of international cooperation to such a devastating loss. It's a reminder of how dangerous space exploration can be and how much courage it takes to keep pushing forward.
Absolutely. And then there was this meeting where Deke Slayton, the guy who assigned astronauts to missions, basically told the group that they were the ones who would be flying to the moon.
And how did Armstrong react?
Well, apparently he was the only one who didn't seem surprised.
So cool under pressure, even then.
Totally. Given all his experience in Gemini, it probably wasn't a total shock. He got assigned to the backup crew for Apollo 9, which was going to test the lunar module in Earth orbit. But there were some delays, and because of the way they rotated crews, Armstrong ended up commanding Apollo 11. There was a little bit of shuffling, though, because Michael Collins, who was supposed to be on Apollo 8, had a medical issue. So Jim Lovell took his place. When Collins was better, he joined Armstrong's crew.
Bit of a musical chairs situation, but in the end, it all worked out.
You could say that. So then they started training for the moon landing, which I've heard was unbelievably demanding, especially practicing with that lunar landing research vehicle, the thing they called the flying bedstead.
Oh, I've seen pictures of that thing. It looks terrifying.
Oh.
Like a bunch of scaffolding with a rocket engine strapped to it.
Yeah, not exactly the most stable contraption, and Armstrong almost died in one of those things.
Seriously, what happened?
He was about 100 feet in the air when the controls failed and it started to spin out of control. He ejected just half a second before it crashed and exploded. Can you imagine the pressure?
Oh my gosh, it's a miracle he survived. So after that,
Mm.
he probably said, no more flying bedstead. Or...
Actually, he still thought it was a valuable training tool. He kept advocating for it and its successor because he felt it gave them crucial experience in how to fly a spacecraft in simulated lunar gravity. He even said it was essential to the success of the actual moon landing.
That's some serious dedication to the mission. So he gets offered the commander spot for Apollo 11, while Apollo 8 is orbiting the moon. And they even offered to replace Buzz Aldrin with Jim Lovell. But Armstrong chose to stick with Aldrin as the lunar module pilot.
Yeah, it was Deke Slayton who gave him the option. But according to his biography, Armstrong said he worked well with Aldrin, and he felt that Lovell deserved to command his own mission later on. It was a pretty selfless move.
It's crazy to think about the pressure and the weight of history bearing down on them. And then, July 16th, 1969, the launch. His wife and sons were watching. His heart rate hit 110 beats per minute. He said the Saturn V rocket was much louder than the Gemini launches.
I bet. It was the most powerful rocket ever built at that time.
Luckily, none of the crew got space sick on the way to the moon.
That's good, especially since Armstrong was prone to motion sickness as a kid.
So the trip to the moon was pretty smooth, but it was the landing that was the really nail-biting part.
For sure. 3 minutes into the descent, they realize they're going to land miles off target. Then the computer alarms start going off. 12:02, 12:01. At first, neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knows what they mean.
Can you imagine? You're trying to land on the moon, and these alarms are blaring, and you have no idea what's going on.
Total chaos. It turns out those alarms were from the lunar module's computer getting overloaded. Buzz Aldrin said he'd accidentally left the rendezvous radar on, which wasn't needed for the landing, and that was bogging down the computer. So Mission Control had to figure out, and fast, if the alarms were serious enough to scrub the landing.
That must have been the longest few seconds ever.
I can't even imagine. Then Armstrong sees that they're heading right for a field of boulders, so he takes over manual control of the lunar module Eagle. Talk about a high-pressure situation.
It's like something straight out of a movie.
I know, right? Fuel's running low, mission control's on edge, and he's got to land this thing manually on a completely alien surface.
They had what they thought was only 40 seconds of fuel left, including the reserve they needed for an emergency abort.
They actually had a little more than that, but it was still crazy close.
And then finally, those words that everyone remembers. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
What a moment.
After all that, they had a handshake and a pat on the back, and then went right back to their checklists, just in case they had to make a quick escape. Talk about focus.
They were trained to stay cool and follow protocol no matter what. So after a quick nap, it was time for the first moonwalk. Armstrong goes down the ladder, says, "I'm going to step off the LM now." And then those famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind."
That quote about the missing A. It's been debated forever.
It really has. NASA and Armstrong insisted for years that static in the transmission messed it up. But his brother even said Niel showed him a written version of the line months earlier and it had the A in it.
So who knows for sure?
Right. Armstrong himself said he hoped history would cut him some slack if he didn't say it, which means he probably meant to say it. There have been all these analyses trying to figure out if the A is there or not. Some say yes, some say no. It's still kind of a mystery.
It's one of those things that makes you realize that even in these monumental moments, there are little details we might never fully know. But the meaning of that quote is clear. A or no A.
Absolutely. It's a perfect summary of what that moment represented for humanity.
And 530 million people were watching. That's mind-blowing. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined him on the moon, becoming the second person to walk there.
And then President Richard Nixon called them from the White House. Imagine that, talking on the phone with someone who's standing on the moon.
It's like something out of science fiction, except it was real. And it's funny, there aren't that many clear pictures of Armstrong from the moon landing.
Yeah, it's because he was usually the one taking the pictures with the Hasselblad camera.
Makes sense. So they set up some scientific experiments, and Armstrong even walked out to East Crater, the farthest point they explored from the lunar module. And as they were about to leave, Armstrong left a small package of memorial items for deceased American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts.
A really touching gesture. It shows that even in the midst of this competition between superpowers, there was still a sense of shared humanity, a recognition of the sacrifices made by those who came before.
Exactly. And then it was time to come home. But they ran into another snag. They'd broken the ignition switch for the lunar module's ascent engine.
What? So how did they get back?
Get this. They used a pen to trigger the launch sequence.
Talk about thinking on your feet. I guess even in space, sometimes the simplest solutions are the best.
They docked with a command module, Columbia, piloted by Michael Collins, and started the trip back to Earth. They landed safely in the Pacific Ocean and were picked up by the USS Hornet. And then came 18 days of quarantine, just in case they brought back some strange moon germs.
Better safe than sorry.
After that, it was the Giant Leap Tour. Parades, a state dinner at the White House, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He even traveled to the Soviet Union, visited the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center.
A real whirlwind. But after all that, he decided not to fly in space again.
Kind of surprising considering his whole life had been about pushing those boundaries.
I know, but he took on other roles at NASA and later became a professor of engineering at the University of Cincinnati. He was also part of some important investigations, like the review board for Apollo 13 and the Rogers Commission after the Challenger disaster.
So he was still involved in space exploration, just in a different way.
Right. He chose to focus on teaching, on sharing his knowledge, and contributing to the safety of future missions. He also did some business stuff, like being a spokesperson for various companies and serving on corporate boards, including Gates Learjet and Thiokol, the company that made the space shuttle's solid rocket boosters.
And remember that North Pole expedition he went on with some other famous explorers?
Yeah, he was really low-key about that one. He didn't want any publicity. He cultivated this image of a reluctant hero, you know? He guarded his name and that famous quote really fiercely, even took MTV and Hallmark to court for using them without permission.
I guess after being thrust into the global spotlight, he just wanted a bit of peace and quiet.
It makes sense. And he was known for being humble and private, turned down tons of interview requests. He would quietly acknowledge New Eagle Scouts for years, but eventually had to stop because it just got overwhelming. He even stopped giving autographs because he found out people were forging them and selling them online.
Wow. Talk about wanting to control your legacy.
For sure.
His personal life had its ups and downs. There were the rumors about him converting to Islam, which turned out to be totally false. He visited his ancestral home in Scotland, kept flying gliders until he was in his 70s.
There was even that strange incident with his wedding ring getting lost in a grain truck.
Life happens, even to astronauts. Sadly, he passed away in 2012 from complications after bypass surgery. The tributes poured in from all over the world. Even President Obama made a statement.
It was a huge loss, but his legacy continues to inspire people. There are countless awards and places named after him, and his authorized biography gives us a really detailed look at his life. He even had some thoughts on the future of space exploration, suggesting that a mission to Mars might actually be easier than landing on the moon was.
That's an interesting perspective. So coming back to that documentary, Astronauts Gone Wild, we didn't go point by point through its claims, but by looking closely at Neil Armstrong's life and career, using reliable sources like his biography and NASA records, we've gotten a pretty clear picture.
Right, and the level of detail in those sources, the rigorous training, the challenges they faced during the mission, it all paints a pretty convincing picture. We've laid out the facts, the context, and now it's up to you to draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. It's not about telling you what to think, but giving you the information you need to decide for yourself.
And what's really fascinating is that sometimes the best way to address these kinds of speculative narratives is not through direct debunking, but by simply presenting a well-researched and comprehensive account of the facts and the human stories involved.
It's about understanding the nuances, the complexity, and the human element behind these historical events. And when you do that, a lot of the doubts tend to fade away on their own.
So, to sum it all up, Neil Armstrong's life was an incredible journey. From a kid who loved flying to the first person to walk on the moon, he was dedicated, skilled, and always pushing boundaries.
It's a story that's both inspiring and humbling.
And it leaves us with a pretty thought-provoking question. Why do these moon landing conspiracy theories persist, even with all the evidence to the contrary?
It's a question about human nature, about our relationship with extraordinary events, of the line between healthy skepticism and, well, just plain denial.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind. There's a whole universe of information out there waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe one day we'll all be walking on the moon ourselves.
That would be amazing.
Until then, keep looking up.